All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to deconstruct the psychological engine that literally allows people to rise from absolute zero to, well, extraordinary success. We often look at these giants of industry, the brilliant creatives, the iconic leaders, and it's so easy to mistakenly assume they were just handed a golden ticket, right? But today, we're looking at the hard science and the real-world stories that prove success actually isn't about where you start. It's all about the psychological toolkit you build along the way.
12. That is the exact number of times publishers slammed their doors and rejected J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter manuscript before she finally found success. I mean, think about that. Before the massive theme parks, the blockbuster movies, and the millions of books sold all over the world, she was just a struggling author getting turned down over and over again by an industry that just kept telling her no. It really shows you just how unreliable the traditional rulebook can be.
And how about $700? That is the tiny, almost totally insignificant loan that John Paul DeJoria used to build a $3.1 billion haircare empire. And the absolute kicker here? He did this right after being fired from his job at a different haircare company. Before this, the guy was literally selling Christmas cards door to door and working as a janitor. He didn't have any sort of safety net. He just had this unshakable belief that when 10 doors get slammed in your face, you just walk right up to door number 11 with a smile.
So this brings us to a pretty massive question. Are these highly successful people just innate geniuses? Were they born with some magical trait that the rest of us completely lack? Or is there actually a scientifically proven hero's engine that any single one of us can consciously build and utilize? Well, spoiler alert, the research tells us it is absolutely the latter.
Section 1. Starting from zero. To really answer our question, let's look at a young boy named Kareem. He was a poor farmer's son who owned absolutely nothing. Yet he had these huge dreams of something bigger. He lived in a mud house with a leaky roof, he wore clothes that were so torn his knees showed through, and he walked barefoot in the mud just trying to practice his letters on a broken slate under a tree.
And you'd think people would support that, right? But instead of encouragement, the villagers and even his own relatives tried to dictate Kareem's destiny. They actually mocked him. They told him his life was already decided, that he would never be anything more than a poor farmer. And honestly, society does this a lot. It constantly tries to hand you a fixed label, essentially telling you to just stay in your lane and accept the circumstances you were born into.
Section 2. Choosing a growth mindset. Now, Kareem completely refused to accept that fixed label. And that brings us to the very fuel of our success engine, a psychological framework identified by Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck. After decades of research, Dweck discovered that one of the most basic beliefs we carry about ourselves completely dictates our potential. Basically, it all comes down to how we view our own capacity to learn.
Dweck's research basically boils down to two paths. First, there's the fixed mindset. This makes you believe your intelligence and character are just static, carved in stone. It makes you terrified of failure because, in this mindset, failing means you are fundamentally deficient. But then there's the growth mindset. This views the hand you're dealt as merely a starting point. With a growth mindset, you don't waste your time trying to prove how great you are. You focus entirely on just getting better. Failure isn't a permanent label anymore. It's literally just data that helps you stretch your abilities.
And this mindset is exactly how someone like Oprah Winfrey, who was born into deep poverty in rural Mississippi and raised in an inner city, could embrace incredible challenges and grow into a billionaire media icon. She completely refused to let her past define her future. Instead, she adopted a growth mindset, famously pointing out that true success really comes when you align your personality with what your soul actually came here to do.
Section 3. The power of grit. So, the crucial point here is this. If a growth mindset is the fuel, what acts as the engine? What actually keeps you moving forward when you're exhausted, completely out of money, and facing constant rejection?
Psychologist Angela Duckworth calls this grit. Through some really extensive studies at places like West Point and the National Spelling Bee, she defined grit as the perseverance and passion for long-term goals. It's a very distinct personality trait that provides the sheer stamina you need to stay the course through massive setbacks. And the wild part, it is completely independent of how smart you might be.
When we actually look at the data, studies show that grit is a way better predictor of long-term success than IQ. In fact, research shows grit is orthogonal, which just means entirely unrelated, or sometimes it's even inversely correlated to intelligence. This perfectly explains why highly intelligent people sometimes just quit when things get hard, while the determined underdogs, who maybe wouldn't score as high on a standardized test, end up winning the marathon of life.
A meta-analysis by researcher Marcus Creed actually found that the most vital piece of grit is simply the perseverance of effort. It is the daily grind. Much like Kareem from our earlier story, right? He's solved a local problem by hauling heavy wooden carts of clean water from the town to his village every single day. He blistered his hands, his back ached, and he persisted through all that mockery until his tiny little water business flourished into a village staple. That's true perseverance.
Section 4. Building atomic habits. Okay, so now that you have the fuel of a growth mindset and the heavy-duty engine of grit, you still need a steering wheel. How do you translate those grand ambitions and that gritty determination into daily, microscopic actions that actually move the needle?
According to James Clear's summary of atomic habits, you've got to completely forget about goals for a second and focus entirely on your identity and your daily systems. Goals are really just about the results you want, but systems are about the processes that lead to those results. Every single action you take is essentially a vote for the type of person you wish to be. So if you want to change your outcomes, you first have to change your identity.
Clear breaks this all down into his 4 laws of behavior change. It's basically a step-by-step checklist to ensure you're actually building the right habits instead of just dreaming about them. To build a good habit, you have to make the cues obvious in your environment, make the action itself attractive, reduce the friction so it's incredibly easy to do, and finally, ensure the reward is actually satisfying.
And you can combine these laws with clever little tactics like habit stacking, which is where you pair a new habit with a specific time and location of a habit you already do anyway. Or you can use the 2-minute rule, which states that a new habit should take less than 2 minutes to start. By reverse engineering your environment like this, you make good habits absolutely inevitable and bad habits utterly impossible.
Section 5. Becoming a hero. Let's bring all this science back to the real world for a second and look at how this exact toolkit, mindset, grit, and habits created some of history's most iconic entrepreneurs, basically out of thin air. These are folks who started with the very definition of nothing.
Whether it's Richard Branson starting a tiny student magazine back in 1966 just because he thought the existing ones were boring, or Do-Wan Chang working as a janitor and a coffee shop attendant before using his $11,000 in savings to launch the Forever 21 retail empire, these billionaires prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you don't need huge piles of cash, conventional wisdom, or elite degrees to begin. In a lot of ways, their lack of wealth was actually their greatest motivator.
The main takeaway here is that your background doesn't need to define your future. Every single rejection you face, just like the 12 that J.K. Rowling faced, is not a failure. It's simply data to feed right back into your growth mindset. It is proof that you're stretching yourself, testing the waters, and allowing that perseverance of effort to eventually break through the barriers.
Steve Jobs, who, let's remember, built Apple out of his parents' garage in California and literally had to find a guarantor just to secure his first $250,000 bank loan, said it best, "Sometimes life is going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith." That brick to the head, it's completely inevitable in life. But your grit is what determines if you keep standing after it hits you. So, we've unpacked the science of the mindset, the raw power of grit, and the daily microscopic habits of the world's most successful underdogs. We've seen that success really isn't magic. It's a structured toolkit that's accessible to absolutely anyone willing to put in the effort. So, the only question left for you is what will you build with it today?